Now, some of the earliest and strongest and long-lasting criticisms of Hobbes emerges actually right in his lifetime in the works of John Locke. John Locke lived, from 1632 to 1704, so younger than Thomas Hobbes. In the latter part of Hobbes's life, John Locke already proposed certain strong criticisms of the Hobbesian perspective. However, taken together, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and a later figure about a century later, in the late 1700s, so the late 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau can be considered, these three can be considered, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau can be considered three of the most prominent and greatest social contract theorists in the Western political tradition. Uh, Locke also starts from a similar premise as Hobbes. He too argues that the establishment of political authority follows from the prior existence of individuals who have certain natural rights. So, in other words, like Hobbes, he starts from the proposition that individuals are originally human beings, originally exist in a state of nature. He defines this state of nature kind of in a similar manner with some key differences, as we'll see. So he defines this state of nature as the state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. So, kind of like Hobbes, he also starts from the uh, premise that human beings live in a state of perfect liberty or freedom to do what they want, to carry out their actions, do what they want with their possessions, including their own persons or bodies, however, within the bounds of law of nature, without having to ask the leave or depending on the will or decision or authority of some other human being. But unlike Hobbes, Locke does not treat this state of nature as a complete free for all, that a person can do whatever they please. As he puts it, this state of nature is not a state of license, that I can do whatever I please to myself or to anyone else. Rather, he argues that individuals are bound by duty to God and governed by the laws of nature. And these laws of nature specify the basic principles of morality. Individuals should not take their own lives, they should try to preserve themselves and each other, and should not infringe upon the liberty of another. And adherence to this law of nature, according to Locke, ensures that the state of nature is not a state of complete war, of all against all. Nonetheless, Locke does recognize that these natural rights of individuals are not always safeguarded or protected in the state of nature. Certain conflicts, or what he calls inconveniences, may arise or do exist in the state of nature. In other words, other individuals may not respect all my rights or all the rights of others. And individuals may be subject to aggressive acts and even violence by others. So, for Locke, therefore, the remedy of these conflicts in the state of nature or the inconveniences in the state of nature is once again a social contract, an agreement to create a civil association or a political government in which they are not transferring all powers to one authority, but rather form sort of a civil government among each other, a sort of political state of being, a political society. So, from a state of nature, they go to a political society where they rule together. So, he has sort of very strong criticisms of Hobbes. To mention two of his more famous quotations, he notes that when the citizens are agreeing to give all the power to the state, how can they be sure that that authority would make society peaceful if there is no recourse? In fact, as he puts it, this is to think that men are so foolish that they would take care to avoid what mischiefs might be done by foxes, but are content to and think it safety to be devoured by lions. So he's drawing sort of a contrast that, yes, in the state of nature, we might face conflicts from other individuals, who may have more or less strength than myself or wits than myself and so on. But this and other, as he calls them, foxes, what he considers smaller threats, polecats or foxes, who may cause mischief to me or cause trouble for me. But that doesn't mean that in order to be safe from these smaller threats, like from foxes and polecats, or smaller threats from fellow human beings, I would be willing to be, in the name of safety, give up power and create this massive lion and be devoured by the lion, which is how he defined the sort of Leviathan or the absolute authority of the same. So, as we can see, he starts from a similar premise that human beings are in a state of nature, and in the state of nature, human beings have have complete freedom to pursue their lives in accordance with their own needs. This freedom doesn't mean that they can just do whatever they please, so we're not in a complete state of war, of all against all. Yet there may be conflicts. People may infringe or be aggressive towards others. And to remedy this, we form a common civil association, or what he calls a political government, a political society, where we come up with rules to govern in accordance with certain laws that we all agree upon. But this does not mean for Locke that we give all power up, give up our power to this all powerful state, or give up all our rights to this all powerful state. Because how can we be sure that this authority will actually make society peaceful? It might do quite the opposite, carry out wars all the time, or even threaten our own well being through sort of authoritarian laws and so on. So this sort of gives us a contrast of two very different ways of looking at two theories which focus on human nature but come up with very different conclusions. So, in conclusion, then, we have seen a wide range of viewpoints in this lecture today. On the one hand, we have hedonism and egoism, both of which focused on the outcomes or consequences of our actions. But we noted some key distinctions. In this lecture, we focused on one set of distinctions. Uh, Egoists generally focus on the outcomes of actions for the individual, those outcomes being defined and evaluated in terms of the self interest of the individual. But egoistic hedonism goes further or is more specific in defining those outcomes for the individual, more specifically in terms of the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. Whereas egoists who may not put themselves in this narrower subset of hedonistic egoists might argue that there are other sort of things that might guide our self interest beyond pleasure. Next, we'll turn to another conception now of hedonism. Now we'll look at another variation of hedonism. In other words, another variation of theories that focus on pleasure or happiness, but in this case, not an individual's own pleasure, but the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. Proposed by one of the most influential schools of modern ethical thinking, known as utilitarianism.